AI is trained to make you feel right. Market research helps you be right.
Welcome to Opportunity Minded, a series for enterprise leaders, corporate strategists, and forward thinkers like you who want to drive business growth. Each episode focuses on a distinct strategic approach to help you unlock opportunities with actionable insights. I'm your host, Jessica, a producer at Euromonitor International. Today I'm joined by Lamine Lawazmia, who leads AI innovation across our research workflows and platform features. We're talking about how and when to use GenAI in market research so you can go faster and stay credible. So I'd like to start off by asking you, Lamine, what was the first time that you got truly excited about the capabilities and possibilities of GenAI and market research?
I've been using generative AI since the very early days. So I guess there are multiple moments where I felt really excited. It's really difficult to pinpoint one in particular. But I would say quite early on, after playing around with it, as most of us did, I started applying it to specific research use cases. And I remember one where I needed to prepare for a presentation, and that involved comparing US consumers and Chinese consumers with regards to snacking. And I thought, I'm going to give this task to, at that time it was ChatGPT, and see how it performs. And I was remarkably impressed by what it had produced. It was confident, it was definitely plausible, it was highly relevant. And I think about how much time I actually put early to actually review all the sources necessary. The fact that ChatGPT back then was able to synthesize a really coherent, plausible sounding answer in such a quick time was truly impressive. It was really something quite magical.
Yeah, I think we've all had that experience where you put something in and what you get back, it feels like magic. But then where does that magic start to go wrong for teams?
I think the longer you use generative AI, the more you become aware of some of its flaws. And so really there's three key things for me in market research. The first is around confidence. Generative AI sounds great. It's always going to sound plausible, but that leads to what we call the plausibility trap. So some of our listeners might be familiar with the term hallucinations, essentially very confident sounding incorrect answers. And that's one of the things to be concerned about when using generative AI in any use case. The second thing is the nature of how large language models work. And fundamentally, they are probabilistic rather than deterministic. So it means they predict a response, but it doesn't guarantee that the same response will always come out. So I could run a particular question, you could run another question. It's the same question at the same time using the same AI models, the same parameters, and you might get a different response. In fact, you probably will get a different response. So getting different answers every time you run a model is something that we generally refer to as the slot machine effect. The third thing I would say here is that AI can be very agreeable, and that leads to what we call either agreement bias or sycophancy. So I'm sure we've all noticed that moment where we tell AI something and then we forget a piece of information and we go back and we say, hey, I forgot to tell you this, and it completely changes its mind.
You're absolutely right.
Exactly. And that can be the danger of using it. So whilst these three traps are something for us to be aware of, they aren't reasons not to use AI. It's just a reason to use AI with intention and with caution in some cases. So generative AI is often a really good starting point, but as you progress and want to create real business impact, you might then need to apply specific data sources, specific special context, and specific adjustments to how the AI models work in order to get the full value from them.
I'd really love to show what those differences are. So I'd like to play a game that we're calling Prompt or Pass to help make this idea a little bit more tangible. So I'm going to give you real research scenarios that someone might take to a widely accessible chatbot. Your job is to tell me if it is a prompt, it's a great place to use GenAI, or pass, time to slow down, bring in the experts, structured data, or methodological guardrails. So, are you ready to go?
Let's do it.
So our first one is
Scan public sources and summarize how longevity is framed in wellness today.
For me, that's a prompt, actually 100%. If you're just trying to get a quick understanding of how a particular document or trend is in a summary, I'd say prompt away.
I'm on it. All right, so the next one is
Estimate next year's market value for ready-to-drink coffee products to include in an investor deck.
I think that one is a pass.
Okay.
What we're trying to do at that point is to create an estimate which requires specialist thinking and context. It also requires synthesis of multiple sources of information. And you probably also want consistency as well. So you don't want to fall into that AI slot machine effect. So for me, that one's a pass. That's one where we might need to work with intention.
The next prompt is
Generate 3 plausible hypotheses for why the ice cream category is softening in Mexico.
I'd say this one is a prompt, but it is a prompt with caution or prompt with intention. So there's nothing wrong with generating plausible hypotheses for why the ice cream category in Mexico might be softening. It's actually really good to ensure that you're hitting all of the most obvious answers, and that's what will come through from the AI. But I think when you want to then start confirming things, that's where there's a real risk involved with using AI. And in particular, you might need some specialist context or specialist data sources. I'm thinking, for instance, of consumer surveys. That will give you real information from the consumer perspective of what they're thinking. I'd also say that expert interviews are a really important source for that particular type of question, ensuring that experts in the market are also seeing that, and then there isn't any sort of hidden or unspoken kind of reason for why the Mexican ice cream market might be softening.
Recommend the top 3 markets to launch a robotic vacuum, factoring in competition and consumer willingness to pay.
Okay, I think this one is most likely going to be a pass. This is a perfect example of where if you're not providing the right context in the form of data or thinking, the AI might draw incorrect conclusions. And this is also where AI sycophancy can haunt you, and the risk of confirmation bias is very real. So I would say this one is an example of a pass, of where you really do need to work with intention. That's not to say don't use AI at all, but it needs a lot of guardrails that go around it.
all right. Last one.
Confirm that consumers in Southeast Asia prefer premium imports to justify premiumization.
Yeah, and I think this one's a pass. I think you can come up with hypotheses with generative AI. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think when it comes, the key word in that sentence for me is confirm. And when we need to confirm something, I think we need specialist data, specialist context, and human expertise to really make sure that we're moving forward with correct assumptions.
Yeah, there's also something in this one. If you ask it to confirm something, it's going to try to confirm.
100%.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, Lamine is going to outline a list of questions that you should be asking yourself before deciding how to use GenAI in your market research workflow. Now let's get into these questions. What are the questions that smart researchers need to be asking themselves before they make that call of to use GenAI or to seek expert advice?
I think the first question that I always ask myself is, what is the cost of being wrong? Not all questions carry the same stakes. Some offer incredibly low risk exploration, or where you might want to be sharing some ideas with colleagues in a sort of low risk environment. But obviously other things might be higher risk. Some things might be, a multi-billion-dollar investment that you're looking for a decision on. And therefore the cost of being wrong might be incredibly high, and in some cases even career ending. So this is where we might need to apply a different level of caution. So what is the cost of getting it wrong?
Can you give us some examples of prompts that might have that lower cost?
So examples of lower costs are really where there isn't much at stake. You might just want to be validating or bouncing ideas off of colleagues. You might even want to put something into an early POC or a pilot, but fundamentally there isn't a large amount of capital or even sort of professional risk associated with the outcome.
Okay. So calling back to our game, that was the ones where we were hypothesizing or giving probable reasons, just sort of generating some ideas.
The flip side of that is where you've got, very important, multi-million or multi-billion-dollar decisions that are coming out the other end. People's professional reputations are on the line. There are impacts to team structure. There are consequences to a decision that you may make. And what I would say is, going further than that, these days, obviously, AI is being used in a lot more of an integrated fashion into people's workflows, agentic AI, so to speak. And so we might be actually using AI to replace parts of the human workflow. And at that point, obviously, you really need to make sure that the outcome is sufficient, it's high quality, and it's reproducible.
Because that cost is not only high monetarily, but like on a human level, that is a high cost.
And it's ongoing.
Mm.
Once you bake something into a workflow, it's not a single decision that's being made, it's 1,000 decisions being made over the course of months and years.
All right. What other questions might people need to ask themselves?
So the second question I think about is whether I need clarity or whether I need credibility. I think generative AI can be really good at getting you clarity, it can help getting you unstuck, it can help summarize, frame the topic in different ways. Um, but credibility requires something slightly different. Credibility requires reputation, it requires consistent definitions, it requires reproducibility, traceability, data that you can footnote, data that other people can follow. And so if we tie this back to the plausibility trap, clarity is not the same thing as credibility.
I'm thinking of some of the answers from prompt or past, but can you give us some examples of some prompts that would just be asking for clarity on something?
So I think some of the questions that you might ask AI that can give you clarity are around helping you to brainstorm or think more widely outside of that. So if we go back to that Mexican ice cream example, you might also want to ask what types of consumer are likely to be triggered by certain sort of consequences or certain hypotheses that you might be putting forward. It really helps you to expand all possibilities in a fairly low cost environment and give you that clarity. But again, it's not credibility. At that stage, you're just using AI to give you plausible hypotheses about what it's doing, and it's not necessarily being validated in anything real.
And what would that credibility question look like?
So the credibility would be quantification, for instance. If you wanted to measure how much a particular driver or factor was influencing a Mexican consumer's willingness to pay, or brand loyalty or anything like that. At that stage, you're prompting something very different. You're trying to ask, how much, and how much is not always going to be a great question to ask an AI.
All right, I think that leads nicely into the next question that people should be asking themselves.
Yes, absolutely. So the third question that I tend to ask myself is, does this need to be reproducible? I think we touched on it in earlier sections in terms of the slot machine effect, and how generative AI is probabilistic in nature. Now, there are things that we can do, again, thinking about using AI with intention, there are things that we can do to make it more deterministic rather than probabilistic, to narrow down a range of possibilities in terms of what the AI might generate. But ultimately, we do have to bear in mind that large language models are there to predict the next word and sometimes the next action. And whenever you're talking about predicting, you're not talking about a certainty, you're talking about a range of highly probable outcomes. So, as I said, this is something that we call the slot machine effect. And there are scenarios, for instance, like trying to size a market or to quantify how much something is important to a particular consumer group, where this type of answer isn't always going to be reproducible. And so, if you need reproducibility as part of what you're doing, if you need to be able to recreate a specific answer or set of outcomes, then using generative AI may not be the solution for you, but it also means that you should be using it with a high level of intention.
Got a pretty good handle on what a prompt for this would be, something that doesn't involve numbers. So just that like creative ideation, bouncing ideas, kind of brainstorming things. But can you give some specific examples of what a pass would be for this one?
We've used it, for instance, to test the thesis on how well it can market size a particular category. So if I was to ask it a question that says, what is the value of all pet care sales in Germany, for instance, that's something that we've done a lot of testing on in the last couple of years. And it's generally speaking not something that you can use just free AI tools with. It will always generate different values, and we've got plenty of examples and evidence to show that it's not just a small variation. Sometimes it can spit out an answer that says it's worth $2 billion in 2024, and then others might say $20 billion. So the range is huge. That level of variability is not something that businesses can rely on.
Something that I've run into is I might get a good response this week, but if I need to do the same thing next week, I can't get the same response from that. And I imagine if you're trying to run a report over time, you're not going to be able to reproduce things.
That is also correct. I think the other thing we have to remember with generative AI is that everything is moving incredibly quickly. We're not working in necessarily a stable environment. Models are being changed and tweaked all the time. There are new functions and features. There are additional data sets which you can load in, and so it's kind of like trying to play chess on a ship, where all the pieces are moving slightly to the left and slightly to the right.
Like you're playing chess on a ship, but then also like every couple of weeks they grab the board out from underneath you and put a new updated board underneath it. And you're like, well, I just got used to this board.
That is entirely correct, right? There are things that you can do to stabilize your environment. And this is again where using generative AI with intention works really well, because you can kind of lock your production environment, make sure that you keep on using the same models, et cetera, et cetera. But when you're using free Gen AI tools, you don't have that luxury. You are using whatever is available, and there might be things in the background that are changing that you wouldn't even see. So again, it's the difference between free AI and using AI with intention.
Moving on to question number 4. What have we got?
So the fourth question I ask myself is whether or not the AI needs any specialist context. And that specialist context can largely take the form of data, tooling, or even specialist experts or input or context, right? Um, these large language models are incredibly powerful. They're trained on God knows how many billions of parameters, and they keep on growing and they keep on becoming more sophisticated. But they can only train on public domain data. And some of our questions, or actually a lot of our questions in the market research sphere, don't just rely on the knowledge that can be found in public domain. And so you need to augment the ability for generative AI to understand some of that specialist context. Now, this is where data providers like Euromonitor come in very handy, because obviously we have a huge volume of high quality private domain data that can help unlock or augment using generative AI. But without that, you are confined to what AI has been trained on, which is a lot of Reddit, a lot of Wikipedia, and a lot of other public domain sources.
I'm going to give my best crack at the prompt or pass examples on this one because I think we've got some good ones from the game. Is that the
Mhm.
prompt on this one would be like the scan publicly available sources to see how people are talking about wellness. And then the pass would be that if you needed validation on the ice cream category in Mexico, you need experts to be able to tell you what's going on.
Absolutely. There are certain industries like tobacco, like alcoholic drinks, where sales occur through different channels. Some of them are very open and public, and others are a little bit more on the grey side. And at Euromonitor, historically, what we've done to unlock the knowledge of what's happening in the area of the grey market is to conduct a lot of in-depth interviews with experts in the field on an anonymized basis, right? So what that does is it gives us a true reading of what's actually happening when something's being imported into a certain country. How much of it is actually being sold in that country versus how much of it is being kind of shipped into a neighboring country through a different sales channel, which may not necessarily be present in the kind of public data. So there are lots of these types of examples that involve certain industries or spheres or even topic types where you need to speak to specialist experts who actually understand what's really happening in the market above and beyond the public domain data.
That makes a lot of sense. All right. And now let's move on to our final question. What is our last question?
So the final question for me is, do I need to be challenged or do I need to be validated? And there are different ways in which people conduct their market research. Many people have already got the decision made up in their head and they simply want plausible confirmation of why that's a great idea. But in a true data-driven decision-making business, you can go in with hypotheses, but you're really looking for those hypotheses to be stress tested, to be pulled apart, because you want to make sure that the outcomes of those hypotheses are as impactful as possible for the business that you're working on. So again, this comes back to the AI sycophancy, or what we refer to as confirmation bias as a service, which is here's an idea that I've got, and the way that AI models are generally trained, the way that human reinforcement learning works, means that they respond positively to trying to make you happy. And we use a phrase at Euromonitor, which is AI is trained to make you feel right. Market research helps you be right. Again, there's a crucial distinction between those two things, that experts in the field are there to challenge your thinking. They're there to tell you when they think that you're actually wrong. And AI will very rarely do that unless, again, you're using AI with specific intention.
Yeah, and I think this kind of loops right back to that what is the cost of being wrong, right? If the cost is really high, then you need somebody there who's going to tell you that it's you're wrong if you're wrong and not just what an excellent idea.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you for sharing those questions. And I want to kind of distill this down to make it a practical workflow. What is the simplest, most repeatable workflow that you would recommend for people as they're making their decisions about using Gen AI or experts?
Okay, so I think the first step, you can always start with generative AI to brainstorm, to come up with comparisons, to come up with early synthesis. One step that I think that people always miss out is asking for feedback
Oh,
with generative AI.
okay.
Okay. People often give the context and then tell it what to do. What they should be learning to do is also to be asking for feedback. What questions should I be thinking of? Try to proactively get into areas where the AI might need more information. The second step here is verifying with structured data. Now, this also depends on the type of question that you're asking or the type of outcome that you're expecting. But think about beyond the public domain information, what else does the generative AI tool really need at its disposal? Does it need those consumer service survey data? Does it need access to a proprietary data set like Euromonitor's passport data set? And so on and so forth. So think about how you can get that structured data into generative AI. The third step is to review, and this is where we come back to feedback again. So interrogate with human expertise. Don't just trust the outcome. Really validate and make sure that it is in line with what you're thinking, and provide it feedback. Tell it where you think it's wrong. Tell it where you think it can do better. Iterate. It's very rarely going to be a question of it gets it right in the first time. Zero shot prompting doesn't always work. Okay. And so that's where we get into the fourth step, which is using generative AI again to produce that second, third, fourth outcome, and using it especially for communication, for storytelling, for formatting, for things that generative AI works really well with out of the box.
The world of AI changes so fast that chessboard gets swapped out all the time. So, what is changing now that leaders need to be preparing themselves for?
Large language models from inception have been about how to predict the next word. It says it in the name, large language models. I think that where we're at right now in 2026 is that everything is moving to what we call large action models, which is how to predict the next action. And that provides a fundamentally new layer of value for users where it's not just thinking about how can it respond to the question you're asking, it's also then thinking about the next three things that it should be doing with that outcome. Should it be emailing it to you, putting it in a report, uploading it to a database? And so this is where there is an increased level of kind of utility from generative AI tools. It's not just a language model now. It can do stuff for us. It can really augment workflows in ways that we hadn't really thought about 2 years ago.
And do you feel like that sort of raises the stakes?
It definitely raises the stakes in 2026 for sure, because it's no longer about just providing me an answer, within a specific context. It's now doing something with that answer, and something can affect team members, it can affect customers, it can affect consumers. So there's the ability for it to be wrong, or for it to generate negative outcomes is even greater, but also the opportunity for it to really augment what we do is also very heightened as well. And that's why ultimately trustworthy, consistent data becomes even more critical in an agent-driven world.
Before we go, if you could give one last piece of advice, what would it be?
I'd say that the age-old wise phrase of delegate the task but never the responsibility applies as much in the AI world as it did in the human world. And so I think we can trust AI, we can work with intention with AI, but we should always be responsible for its final outcome.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Opportunity Minded, brought to you by Euromonitor International, the first destination for organizations seeking growth. A big thank you to Lamine for sharing your expertise with us today. Where can people get in touch with you?
LinkedIn is probably the most obvious place.
Stay connected with us on social media or visit our website to explore more resources and join our community. Until next time, stay opportunity minded. Any favorite prompts?
My favorite phrase is ask me any clarifying questions you need before you get started.
That's such a hot tip.
So you can append that to almost any prompt